I married a man I never met. I signed my name at the bottom of the document with a hand that trembled just enough to betray me. The ink dried quickly, as if eager to seal a life I had only imagined. Outside the registry office, the city moved with its usual confidence traffic humming, footsteps purposeful, laughter drifting from a cafe. Inside, I stood still, newly married to a man I had never met. It began, as many modern stories do, with a message. Not a love letter, not a confession, just a practical note sent through a family connection. He lived far away. Our families had known each other for years. Circumstances aligned, elders spoke, and a proposal arrived like a carefully wrapped parcel placed on my doorstep. No dramatic gestures, no stolen glances, only facts, age, profession, values, intentions, a promise of steadiness, a life that would make sense. I told myself that love could grow from respect, that trust could be cultivated like a garden if one tended it patiently. I told myself that marriages built on fireworks often burned out, while quiet ones endured. I repeated these ideas until they sounded like my own beliefs. The wedding was small and efficient. There were photos taken of me smiling beside an empty space that would later be filled digitally. People congratulated me, their voices warm, their eyes curious. "You'll meet him soon," they said, as if meeting were a minor detail, like choosing curtains or learning a new route to work. I nodded, practiced in the art of agreement. That night, alone in the apartment arranged by relatives, I lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar silence. Marriage, I realized, had not changed my surroundings. The walls were the same. The ceiling fan hummed, as it always had. Yet something inside me had shifted, like a compass needle suddenly pointing in a new direction. My future now included a person whose face I could not picture, whose habits I could not predict. Our conversations were careful at first. Messages sent across time zones, polite and measured. He asked about my day. I asked about his work. We exchanged photos of meals, whether the occasional book. He wrote clearly, thoughtfully, never too much, never too little. There was comfort in his consistency. Still, when the screen went dark, questions crowded in. How did he laugh? Did he speak with his hands? What did he do when he was nervous? Friends reacted in different ways. Some admired my courage, calling it faith or tradition or strength. Others frowned, lowering their voices as if discussing a risky investment. "Aren't you afraid?" they asked. I was, but fear had become a quiet companion, not an alarm. It sat beside me, reminding me to be alert, not to run. Weeks passed, then months. We learned each other in fragments. I discovered he woke early and liked the discipline of morning routines. He learned that I worked best at night. When the world softened, we disagreed gently about movies, strongly about politics, and surprisingly found common ground in our dislike of crowded places. These details stitched together an outline of a person, but an outline is not a body, not a presence. The day we finally planned to meet felt unreal, like a date postponed so many times it had become a legend. At the airport, my heart pounded with an intensity no message had ever caused. I scanned faces, each stranger briefly transformed into a possibility. When he appeared, there was no thunder, no cinematic pause. Just a man walking toward me, looking as uncertain as I felt. We stood facing each other, married, and meeting for the first time. He smiled, and something inside me loosened not into love, not yet, but into recognition. He was real. His voice matched his words. His presence filled the space between us in a way no screen ever had. That first week was awkward and revealing. We negotiated silence and conversation, personal space and shared routines. Small habits emerged, how he folded his clothes, how I took my coffee. There were moments of doubt sharp enough to sting, and moments of ease that surprised us both. We learned that commitment did not erase difference. It demanded patience with it. People often ask now if I would recommend it marrying someone you have never met. I never know how to answer. My story is not advice. It is not proof. It is simply a life unfolding in an unexpected order. Love, I have learned, does not always arrive before commitment. Sometimes it walks in afterward, cautious but curious, checking if there is room to stay. I married a man I never met, and in doing so, I met parts of myself I had never known. My capacity for trust, my tolerance for uncertainty, my understanding that certainty is often an illusion we chase to feel safe. What I have now is not a fairy tale, not a warning tale either. It is something quieter, built day by day, face to face at last. And perhaps that is what marriage truly is, not the certainty of knowing, but the courage to keep learning, even when the beginning defies every expectation. After the first week, the world stopped holding its breath for us. There were no more welcoming dinners, no carefully planned introductions. Life settled into its ordinary rhythm, and that was when the real work began. Mornings arrived without ceremony. We learned how each other moved through space, how he paused before speaking when thinking carefully, how I filled silence when I felt uncertain. We learned that intimacy was not a switch but a language, and neither of us was fluent yet. There were evenings when we sat on opposite sides of the room, sharing nothing but the same air, wondering privately if this distance was normal or dangerous. I realized how much romance had trained me to expect instant recognition to souls, locking eyes and knowing. What we had instead was gradual familiarity, the slow accumulation of evidence. He always locked the door at night. I always checked the stove twice. He noticed when I was quiet longer than usual. I noticed when his jokes grew sharper, a sign of stress. These were not grand gestures, but they carried weight. Conflict arrived quietly. It did not shout, it lingered. We argued about schedules, about priorities, about the invisible rules we had each brought into the marriage without realizing it. There were moments when I wondered if love could truly grow here, or if we were only practicing politeness in a shared space. Once, during a disagreement that felt heavier than the rest, he asked me if I regretted marrying a stranger. The question stayed with me long after the room went silent. I thought about the life I might have chosen, discovering, leaving, trying again. I thought about the illusion of control that path offered, and I answered him honestly. I told him I did not regret marrying a stranger, but I feared remaining strangers forever. That fear, I said, mattered more than how we began. Something shifted after that conversation. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. We stopped trying to perform marriage and started practicing honesty. We admitted when we felt lonely in the same house. We named expectations instead of assuming them. We allowed disappointment to exist without treating it as failure. Affection arrived unexpectedly, not in declarations, but in gestures so small they almost escaped notice. He learned exactly how I liked my tea. I learned the stories behind his silences. We began to laugh, tentatively at first, then freely. Laughter, I discovered, was a powerful form of recognition. There were still days when doubt returned, days when I envied couples whose love stories began with certainty instead of courage. But those thoughts grew quieter as shared memories accumulated. Our first grocery shopping trip that turned into an argument and ended in shared exhaustion. Our first holiday, awkward and imperfect, but ours, the first time he reached for my hand without thinking it. I understood then that meeting someone is not a single moment. It is a process that continues long after names are exchanged and vows are signed. I had not met my husband on our wedding day or even at the airport. I was meeting him slowly, daily, through repetition and repair. Love, when it finally made itself known, did not arrive as a rush. It arrived as relief. The relief of being able to rest beside someone without pretending. The relief of knowing that misunderstandings did not mean collapse. The relief of choosing each other again, not because of obligation, but because of familiarity earned. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how easily this story could have gone differently. How fear or pride could have closed doors before they opened. How waiting for certainty might have meant waiting forever. I do not romanticize the risk I took, but I respect it now. It asked more of me than comfort ever could. I married a man I never met, and in time I met him fully, not as an idea, not as a promise, but as a person, flawed, patient, learning alongside me. Our marriage did not begin with love, but it made room for it. And that, I have learned, is sometimes enough to change everything. I signed my name at the bottom of the document with a hand that trembled just enough to betray me. The ink dried quickly, as if eager to seal a life I had only imagined. Outside the registry office, the city moved with its usual confidence traffic humming, footsteps purposeful, laughter drifting from a cafe. It began, as many modern stories do, without romance and without drama. There was no sudden spark, no secret messages exchanged at midnight. It began with a conversation between families, measured and careful, spoken in tones of practicality rather than passion. His name was mentioned like a solution, not a dream. He lived far away. He was ready for marriage. He was, according to those who knew him, reliable. I was asked what I wanted. I said I wanted peace, stability, a future that did not feel like a constant gamble. Those words, once spoken, seemed to decide everything for me. The proposal arrived not with flowers, but with details, age, education, work, values, expectations. There was comfort in how little imagination was required. I could agree without risking disappointment. I could step forward without falling in love first, which felt safer than falling and hoping someone would catch me. I told myself love could come later. I told myself that love built on friendship lasted longer than love born from intensity. I repeated these beliefs until they settled into my bones. Or perhaps I wanted them to. The wedding itself was small, efficient, and oddly quiet. Relatives smiled, congratulated me, took photographs that felt incomplete. In some of them, there was space beside me, space that would later be filled digitally with a man who was, at that moment, still a stranger. People said kind things. You're brave. You're doing the right thing. Everything will fall into place. I nodded, thanked them, smiled when required. I had become very good at looking calm. That night, alone in the apartment prepared for us, the reality arrived without warning. Marriage had changed my legal status, but nothing else had shifted yet. The rooms were silent. My phone lay face down on the table. I was someone's wife, and yet I was still alone. The contradiction pressed against my chest until sleep finally claimed me. Our communication began cautiously. Messages sent across distance and time zones. Polite questions, thoughtful answers. We spoke about work, routines, whether he was respectful, consistent, never intrusive. There was something reassuring in that steadiness, but also something distant. I read his words carefully, searching for tone, for personality, for warmth hidden between sentences. Sometimes I wondered if he was doing the same with mine. Friends reacted in ways that revealed more about them than about me. Some admired my trust in tradition. Others whispered their doubts as warnings disguised as concern. What if you don't like him? What if he's not who you expect? I listened without defending my choice. I did not have answers. I only had a decision already made. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, fragments of his life became familiar. He liked structure. He woke early. He believed discipline was a form of self-respect. I learnt these things the way one learns facts from a book, informative but distant. He learnt that I worked best late at night. That silence helped me think that I struggled with overthinking more than I admitted. Still, there were gaps, large ones. I did not know how he reacted when angry, or how he laughed when something truly amused him. I could not imagine how it would feel to share space with him, to negotiate daily life, to argue and reconcile. The day we finally arranged to meet felt unreal, like preparing for a meeting with a character from a story I had been reading for too long. At the airport, my heart raced with an intensity no message had ever provoked. Every unfamiliar face looked briefly like possibility. When he appeared, there was no cinematic pause, no music swelling in the background. Just a man walking toward me, his expression cautious, his eyes searching. We stopped a few steps apart, married and meeting for the first time. He smiled. I smiled back. Something loosened inside me, not love, not relief exactly, but grounding. He was real, solid. Present. The first days were awkward in quiet ways. We were careful with each other, as if any sudden movement might shatter something fragile. Conversation came and went in waves. Silence filled the rest. We observed each other constantly, learning without asking, how he placed his shoes neatly by the door, how I reorganized the kitchen without realizing it, how he paused before speaking when choosing words, how I spoke quickly when nervous. We disagreed about schedules, about priorities, about how much space togetherness required. At times, the weight of expectation pressed down on me. We were married. Shouldn't this feel easier? One evening, during a disagreement that lingered longer than usual, he asked me if I regretted marrying someone I had never met. The question landed softly but deeply. I thought carefully before answering. I told him the truth. I did not regret marrying a stranger. I regretted the possibility of staying strangers forever. that if we were going to do this, I wanted us to truly arrive in each other's lives. That conversation changed something fundamental. We stopped performing what we thought marriage should look like. We began admitting when we felt lost, lonely, or unsure. We named expectations instead of assuming them. We allowed disappointment to exist without treating it as failure. Affection arrived quietly, not through declarations, but through attention. He remembered how I took my tea. I learned which silences meant peace and which meant stress. We began to laugh not because we tried to, but because comfort had finally entered the room. There were setbacks, days when I envied couples whose stories began with passion and certainty. Moments when fear whispered that this was a mistake unfolding slowly. But those moments were met with something new: shared memories. The first time we cooked together and failed. The first holiday that felt awkward but intimate. The first spontaneous gesture that was not planned or expected. I had not met my husband at the wedding or even at the airport. I was meeting him daily through repetition, conflict, forgiveness, and care. Love did not arrive dramatically. It did not announce itself. It arrived as safety, as relief, as the ability to rest beside someone without pretense. It arrived when I noticed that his presence no longer required effort, and my absence from his side felt strange. I married a man I never met, and in doing so, I met parts of myself I had never explored. My capacity for patience, my tolerance for uncertainty, my understanding that certainty is often an illusion we chase to feel protected. Our marriage did not begin with love, but it made space for it. And sometimes I believe that space is more important than the timing. Because love that arrives later does not arrive weaker. It arrives informed. It knows what it is choosing. And every day, quietly, deliberately, we choose each other again. As time passed, the question people asked most often shifted from "How could you do that?" to "Are you happy now?" Happiness, I learned, was a complicated word. It was not a permanent state. It did not stay. It visited, left, returned quietly. Some days it arrived disguised as routine. Other days it came only after effort. There were mornings when we moved around each other with ease, sharing space like people who had always known how, and there were mornings when tension lingered in the air. Born from nothing specific, just the accumulated weight of two different inner worlds learning to coexist. Marriage, I discovered, was not a merging, but a negotiation that never truly ended. We learned each other's histories slowly, carefully. Not everything could be shared at once. He carried responsibilities that had shaped him into someone serious beyond his years. I carried disappointments that had made me cautious where others were hopeful. When these pasts surfaced, they sometimes clashed, sometimes aligned, but always demanded acknowledgement. There were moments when I wanted to retreat into independence, to remember what it felt like to make decisions without considering another person. And there were moments when I surprised myself by seeking his opinion, his reassurance, his presence. Dependency, I realized, was not weakness when it was chosen rather than forced. Intimacy deepened in unexpected ways. It was not built solely through closeness, but through repair, through apologies that were not followed by excuses, through arguments that ended not with victory, but with understanding, through choosing to stay in conversations that would have been easier to abandon. One evening, after a long day that had left us both quiet and distant, he told me he had once feared I would always feel trapped by this marriage. He admitted that he worried he would forever be the man I accepted, not the man I wanted. His honesty startled me. I had been so focused on my own uncertainty that I had not considered his. That night I understood something fundamental. Marrying a stranger does not remove vulnerability, it multiplies it. Both people step into the unknown carrying silent fears, hoping the other will not confirm them. We grew gentler after that, with ourselves, with each other. I stopped measuring our relationship against imagined standards, against love stories that began with longing and certainty, against timelines that promised emotional clarity by specific milestones. Our story refused to be measured that way. It unfolded at its own pace, sometimes frustratingly slow, sometimes surprisingly fast. Trust, once established, became the quiet foundation beneath everything. Not the dramatic trust of blind faith, but the steady trust built from consistent behavior. He showed up. I stayed honest. When one of us faltered, the other noticed. That noticing mattered more than perfection ever could. I began to recognize love in places I had not been taught to look, in shared responsibilities, in restraint during anger, in choosing patience when withdrawal would have been easier. Love did not feel like being swept away. It felt like being held in place. Sometimes I still think about the woman I was when I signed that document. The one whose hand trembled slightly as ink met paper. She believed she was choosing safety over uncertainty. She did not know she was choosing a different kind of courage. I married a man I never met, and the world did not collapse, nor did it magically align itself into a perfect shape. Instead, it asked me to participate, to listen, to adapt, to grow. It asked me to let go of the idea that love must arrive first to be real. Now, when I look at him, I do not see a stranger I agreed to marry. I see a person I continue to choose, and perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath all lasting relationships. We do not marry who we know completely, we marry who we are willing to keep discovering. The beginning of our story defied expectation. The continuation required intention, and the future, still unwritten, feels less frightening now that I understand this one thing. Love does not always begin with meeting. Sometimes it begins with staying. Staying, I learned, was an active choice. It was not passive endurance, nor was it romantic sacrifice. Staying meant waking up each day and deciding that curiosity was more useful than judgment. That listening mattered more than winning, that understanding was worth the discomfort it sometimes required. As the months turned into years, our marriage acquired texture. It was no longer defined by how it began, but by how it functioned. The extraordinary faded, replaced by the ordinary, and it was within that ordinariness that something solid took root. We built rituals without noticing. Morning tea on the balcony when the air was still cool. Grocery shopping on weekends, unplanned but always ending the same ways, lightly amused, quiet evenings where conversation was optional, presence enough. These moments would have seemed insignificant to an outside observer, but they were the stitches holding everything together. There were also fractures, moments when exhaustion sharpened our words, when misunderstandings layered themselves until even small comments felt heavy. Once, during a period of prolonged stress, we drifted so far into our separate coping mechanisms that silence became louder than argument. I wondered, not for the first time, if the way we began had made it easier to retreat. But marriage, I discovered, does not reward escape. It exposes it. We learned to return. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but honestly. Sometimes returning meant admitting fear. Sometimes it meant admitting resentment. Sometimes it meant saying, I don't know how to fix this, but I don't want to leave it broken. Those were the moments that mattered most. People assume that marrying someone you never met means risking incompatibility. What they do not consider is how many people marry someone they have met sometimes for years only, to discover later that familiarity does not guarantee understanding. Knowing facts about a person is not the same as knowing how they show up when life applies pressure. Pressure reveals character. It reveals patience, avoidance, generosity, rigidity. We met each other fully, not in romance, but in responsibility, in illness, in financial strain, in family obligations that arrived uninvited. Those experiences stripped away politeness and replaced it with truth. I watched him struggle without hiding it. He watched me doubt without dismissing it. In those moments, admiration replaced idealization. Respect replaced fantasy. What grew between us was not the excitement of discovery, but the steadiness of recognition. There were days when I missed the idea of falling in love, the way stories describe it: sudden, consuming, unmistakable, but those days grew fewer as I realized something important. Passion that arrives instantly often demands maintenance just as intense to survive. What we had was quieter, but it did not demand performance. It asked only for presence. I stopped explaining our story to people who wanted simple conclusions. It was neither a cautionary tale nor a success story in the way they expected. It was a living process, one that could not be summarized without losing its truth. Occasionally, I imagined an alternate version of my life, one where I had waited, searched, chosen differently. That version did not feel better or worse. It felt simply unknown. And I had learned by then that unknown paths are not inherently superior just because they remain unexplored. What mattered was not how many options I had declined, but how fully I inhabited the one I had chosen. One evening, long after the anxiety that once defined our beginning had faded, we talked about that first day at the airport, the awkwardness, the distance. He admitted he had been terrified, afraid of disappointing me, afraid of being rejected by someone who was already his wife. I laughed softly, realizing how symmetrical our fears had been. We had both entered the marriage believing we were the one taking the greater risk. In truth, we had met in the same vulnerability. I no longer say that I married a man I never met as a confession. I say it as context. The more accurate truth is that I married a man before I knew him and then chose to know him deeply, patiently, imperfectly. Love, in the end, did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as commitment honored repeatedly. It arrived as effort that felt worthwhile. It arrived as the quiet certainty that this person, once a stranger, now knew the shape of my days and still remained. If I have learned anything from this life, it is this: beginnings matter far less than continued. The story is not decided by its opening chapter, but by the willingness to keep writing when the novelty fades. I married a man I never met, and in staying, in choosing, in returning again and again, I learned that love is not found, it is built. Building, however, is not a straight line. There were seasons when construction slowed, when progress felt invisible, times when we questioned whether what we were building was strong enough to last or merely held together by habit and effort. Those questions did not mean failure. They meant awareness. And awareness, though uncomfortable, became one of our greatest allies. As life expanded, so did our responsibilities. Careers demanded more. Families leaned in closer. Decisions carried heavier consequences than they once had. We learned that love in practice often looks like logistics calendars aligned. Priorities negotiated, sacrifices made quietly rather than announced. Romance did not disappear. It changed shape. It lived in reliability, in follow-through, in the assurance that neither of us would vanish when things became difficult. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, when I wondered if choosing commitment before connection had cost me something essential. In those moments, I paid attention to what was actually present rather than what I imagined missing. I saw how we handled conflict with increasing care, how apologies came sooner, how empathy replaced defensiveness. These were not accidents. They were skills we had learned together. I realized then that compatibility is not discovered, is developed. Two people do not arrive perfectly aligned. They adjust, sometimes painfully, sometimes gracefully. We adjusted our expectations, our communication, our understanding of each other's limits. We stopped trying to fix differences and started managing them. There was a quiet turning point I did not recognize at first. One day, during a minor disagreement, I noticed that my instinct was no longer to protect myself from loss, but to protect the relationship from harm. That shift was subtle, but profound. It meant that the marriage was no longer something happening to MIT, was something I belonged to. Belonging did not erase individuality. If anything, it sharpened it. We learned to support each other's independence rather than feel threatened by it. Time apart no longer felt like distance. It felt like breathing room. Time together felt chosen, not obligatory. Sometimes I think about how our story might sound to someone who believes love must be immediate to be real. I understand that belief. I once held it myself. But I have learned that immediacy and depth are not the same thing. What grows slowly often roots deeply. What is tested early often endures longer. I no longer measure our marriage by how it compares to others. Comparison, I learned, is a distraction from presence. Every relationship carries its own challenges, its own compromises, its own private victories. Ours simply began in an unusual order. What surprises me most now is not that love Gruber, that trusted. Trust that we would continue choosing honesty over comfort. Trust that difficulty would not automatically mean collapse. Trust that even when understanding lagged behind intention, patience could bridge the gap. If I could speak to my younger self, the woman signing her name with a trembling hand, I would not tell her everything would be easy. That would be dishonest. Instead, I would tell her this: you will grow stronger than your fear. You will learn that uncertainty is survivable. You will discover that love does not always arrive as a feeling first, but as a decision honored consistently. I married a man I never met, and I stopped waiting for certainty to grant me permission to live fully. I learned to live forward, with questions unanswered, with trust imperfect, with courage practiced daily. And now, when I look at him, I do not think about how we began. I think about how far we have come without realizing it. About the shared language we developed from scratch. About the resilience born from choosing each other without guarantees. Our story does not prove that marrying a stranger is right or wrong. It proves something quieter, something more universal, that love is not defined by how well you know someone at the start, but by how willing you are to keep knowing them, even when certainty never fully arrives. And that perhaps is the most honest kind of love there is. With time, the urgency to define our marriage faded. I no longer needed to explain it to myself or to anyone else. It existed. It functioned. It breathed. And in that breathing space, I began to notice how deeply it had woven itself into my sense of self. There was a period when life grew unexpectedly heavy, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just persistently demanding. Responsibilities overlapped. Energy thinned. Joy became less expressive, more subdued. In that season, love did not announce itself. It worked silently. It showed up in shared exhaustion, in wordless understanding, in the absence of blame when neither of us had much left to give. I learned then that love is not always felt. Sometimes it is enacted. Sometimes it is the decision not to withdraw when disappointment tempts retreat. Sometimes it is choosing kindness when neutrality would be easier. These choices did not feel heroic. They felt necessary. There were nights when we lay side by side, not touching, not talking, yet deeply aware of each other's presence. Those nights taught me something stories never had. Intimacy is not always closeness. Sometimes it is shared stillness. Sometimes it is allowing another person to exist beside you without demanding more than they can offer. Gradually, trust transformed into something quieter and reliance, not dependence, not expectation, but the confidence that if something broke, we would face it together. That confidence did not eliminate fear, it softened it. Fear became information rather than command. I noticed how our disagreements changed over time. They grew shorter, less performative, more focused on resolution than defense. We stopped arguing to be understood and started arguing to understand. That shift alone altered everything. Once during a conversation about our future, he said something that stayed with me. Dante, need to know how this ends. I just need to know we're honest while we're here. In that moment, I realized how far we had traveled from the beginning, when everything had felt like a test with a pass-or-fail outcome. Our marriage was no longer a question. It was a context. I stopped wondering whether love would leave if circumstances changed. I saw how it adapted, how it bent without breaking, how it matured alongside us. Love, I learned, is not fragile when it is practiced rather than idealized. Sometimes people still react with disbelief when they hear how our story began. They wait for a conclusion, regret, or triumph. I offer neither. I offer reality, a marriage that required more intention than fantasy, a love that did not rescue me from uncertainty, but taught me how to live with it. I married a man I never met, and over time that fact lost its shock. What remained was something far more meaningful. I married someone willing to grow with me, and I became someone capable of growing alongside another. If this story has an ending, it is not certainty, it is continuity. We did not fall into love. We walked into it slowly, deliberately, and kept walking even when the path was unclear. And perhaps that is the truest form of meeting another person, not in a single moment, but across years of choosing to stay present when leaving would have been simpler. That is how strangers become partners. That is how commitment becomes love. As the years unfolded, the memory of our beginning softened. It did not disappear, but it stopped demanding attention. It became background rather than foreground, a fact, rather than a defining feature. What mattered now was not how we started, but how we carried what we had built forward. There was a quiet confidence that settled into our days. Not excitement, not certainty, but something steadier. We stopped bracing for collapse. We stopped asking if we were doing marriage correctly. Instead, we asked simpler questions. Are we being honest? Are we being fair? Are we paying attention? Those questions guided us better than any rule book ever could. I noticed how my body responded to his presence. Once, I had been alert around him, monitoring every interaction, searching for signs of danger, of compatibility, of reassurance. Now my body rested. That, more than any declaration, told me something essential had shifted. Safety is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply allows you to exhale. There were still moments of loneliness. Marriage does not erase them. It reframes them. Sometimes loneliness came from within, unrelated to him, and I learned not to place responsibility where it did not belong. Sometimes it came from missed connections, from assumptions unspoken. In those moments, we learned to ask rather than accuse, to reveal rather than retreat. Revelation, I discovered, is an ongoing act. You do not reveal yourself once and remain known forever. People change. Needs shift. Fears evolve. Loving someone long term means staying curious even when you believe you already understand them. Especially then, we grew older together in subtle ways, not just through birthdays or photographs, but through the way our conversations deepened. We spoke more about meaning than milestones, about balance rather than ambition. Success stopped being something to chase and became something to sustain. We learned to protect our energy, our time, our connection. There were external changes, two moves, transitions, losses that arrived without asking permission. Loss, especially, taught us about the depth of our bond. Grief does not ask for compatibility. It demands presence. And in presence, we found each other again, stripped of expectation, united by endurance. I realized then that marrying a stranger had prepared us, in an odd way, for life's uncertainties. We had begun without guarantees. We had learned early that trust is built, not assumed. When the world shifted beneath us, that lesson held. Occasionally, I would catch him watching Minot with evaluation, not with uncertainty, but with familiarity. That look startled me every time. Familiarity, I had once believed, was boring. I had been wrong. Familiarity was recognition earned over time. It was the knowledge of patterns, moods, strengths, and weaknesses held without judgment. I thought again of the woman I had been at the beginning, careful, measured, afraid of making the wrong choice. I no longer felt the urge to correct her or reassure her. She had done the best she could with what she knew, and what she chose, imperfect as it was, became the ground on which everything else grew. Our marriage never became a story I told for effect. It became a place I lived, and living, I learned, is far more demanding and far more meaningful than storytelling. If there is wisdom here, it is not dramatic. It does not promise happiness or warn against risk. It simply observes. You do not need to know someone fully to begin, but you must be willing to keep knowing them to continue. I married a man I never met, and over time we met each other in the only way that truly matters, through shared days, shared failures, shared patience, and the quiet, persistent choice to remain. That choice, repeated enough times, became love.